For the longest time, I thought electromagnetic pulses, those bursts of invisible radiation that can wipe out power grids and shut down entire cities, were just sci-fi fantasy, the kind of thing you would see in The Matrix or Hollywood disaster movies. But I was wrong. The United States actually has a task force on EMPs, and real scientists have been warning about these threats for decades. One of them is here with me today. Professor Stephen Starr is the former director of the University of Missouri's Clinical Laboratory Science program and a senior scientist at the Physicians for Social Responsibility. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you, Pascal. It's an honor to be on your show.
Thank you very much for coming online. And you are a friend and colleague also of Ivana Hughes and Jeffrey Sachs and that world. And you've been one of the people who's been working very closely on really what sounds like science fiction. But can you maybe tell us what are EMPs and why are they a real threat actually?
Well, electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, is a burst of invisible energy that will not harm humans, plants, or animals or structures, but it can induce massive voltages and currents into any electrically conductive material, particularly power lines, antennas, telecommunication lines. For example, a medium distribution power line can have 2 million volts and 5 to 10,000 amps induced into it. This happens at the speed of light, so surge protectors that could protect against lightning are no use, protect against EMP. So when that happens, anything that's plugged into the grid that has solid-state electronics gets fried because, you can damage your computer with static electricity. So if you get 50,000 volts coming in through the through the wall, and that goes for, your appliances and just about everything that you have in the house. It can also knock out probably 10 to 20% of all the cars that wouldn't start. It knocks out, well, the E1 basically destroys all the solid-state electronics instantly. And then a few seconds later, there's an E3 wave that comes down, and it will damage the extra high voltage circuit breakers and large power transformers that are required for the long-distance transmission of electricity in the grid. And about 90% of the electricity goes through these. So you lose those, and the grid is out. And we do not stockpile those. They have to be custom designed and manufactured. Large power transformers weigh between 400 and 800,000 pounds each, and so they're not easy to transport or install. The current wait time for those is 1.5 to 4 years, and 80% are made overseas. So if you damage those to the point where they don't, a majority of them do not work anymore, then entire regions will be without electricity for years, literally. And it only takes, even one super EMP weapon could accomplish this. What I've written about, I wrote an article for the UNS Review recently in June of this year about an EMP attack on the U.S. that utilized 3 ballistic missiles, 3 warheads detonated over the continental U.S. And I can go into that more later. So that's kind of a long answer, but maybe that helps.
Two questions, and I know you also prepared slides for us to look at, but before that, two issues. What kind of weapon can induce such a blast? A, and B, why have we never seen one? I mean, we've had now nuclear weapons for the last. Sorry, there was a bird that just crashed into my windows. It's scary. Anyhow, why have we never seen such a blast? Although we've been living since 1945 with nuclear weapons.
Well, that's probably a matter of good fortune, but what I write about, a nuclear weapon detonated on the surface of the Earth, creates enormous blast, fire, local radioactive fallout. But what I'm talking about are nuclear detonations that occur above the atmosphere. Ideally, it's around 100 miles to 300 miles up. And, even a satellite orbiting over us could be a nuclear weapon. They could design one like that. We haven't seen that because nobody's used a nuclear weapon in combat since 1945. But there's 12,000 or more nuclear weapons in the world today. I taught a class of nuclear weapons at the university for 11 years, and people don't even understand how many nuclear weapons there are. But I was focused for years on the effects of war, ground use. But if you detonate just 1 to 3 of these, you can take out the grid and all the electronics and basically probably wipe out most of the population within a year because you would have no electricity and no critical national infrastructure.
But just to clarify, every nuclear weapon is actually also an EMP weapon because they radiate that. It's not just the blast itself, it's the electromagnetic shock that comes with it.
Yeah, what happens is at the moment of detonation, a nuclear weapon emits a lot of gamma rays. And a super EMP weapon can focus the gamma rays towards the Earth. And the gamma rays, they come down at the speed of light. When they hit the atmosphere, they rip the electrons off the air molecules and send them spinning towards Earth. They interact with the Earth's magnetic field and they create, in effect, a giant electric current in the atmosphere. And that induces the massive currents into the power lines, transmission lines. And this all happens at about 90% of the speed of light, a few billionths of a second. That's all it takes for the E1 wave to hit.
Is this, if you have this in your presentation, is this the place where we shall look at it?
Sure. I'd be glad. I think that's a good idea. I'll share my screen here.
Please.
Well, this is the first photograph of an EMP. It was taken in 1962. The detonation occurred 860 miles away from Hawaii. This was taken from Honolulu. This photo, you can see what an enormous flash it made. EMP attack would occur at night because that's when it's by far more effective for the E3.
And
They had to detonate that. Go ahead.
Sorry, is this visible light like in our?
Yeah, that's a big flash of light in the. If you look down here in the corner, those are like telephone poles down there. That's the island, and it lit up the sky, the whole horizon. They had to detonate the weapon further away than if it was within 400 miles, it could cause people to go blind.
Oh.
So nuclear weapons are almost unimaginably powerful. So that at that time in 1962, we didn't have solid state electronics. They just had, tubes. But it did knock out street lights and that sort of thing. But it took a while before they started to understand what EMP was. So as I mentioned before, the nuclear detonation above the atmosphere doesn't create fires, blasts, or local radiation. But it does create an invisible burst of high intensity energy that doesn't harm plants, animals, humans, or structures, but it will induce massive voltages and currents into any electrically conductive material. And as I mentioned, the EMP E1 wave that comes down to the speed of light will induce 2 million volts and 5,000 to 10,000 amps of current into medium distribution power lines. Now, they're not designed to handle this. The 15 kilovolt lines get 200,000 to 400,000 volts. This is a picture of the 3 grids in the United States. A grid is basically the power generating facility, and it's connected to the end consumers with long distance transmission lines.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a picture from the article I had in the UNS Review, and the 3 circles are where 3 nuclear detonations occur over the U.S. They're ballistic missiles fired from a submarine. It takes less than a minute to fire 3 of them from 200 miles off the Florida coast. It takes 5 to 7 minutes for the warheads to reach their target. The U.S. will be able to detect such a launch, but we wouldn't be able to intercept it. We have no capability. And the large circles show the exposure area. There's hundreds of thousands of square miles for each one. The EMP is a line of sight phenomena, so it blankets the United States. The inner circles are where the most intense EMP occurs. There's 12,500 to 50,000 volts per meter, and that will induce current even if you're not plugged into the grid. It can just induce 50,000 volts into an AC power cord, for example. It burns up the things like everything that solid state electronics, the computers, cell phones, routers, switches, your modems, microchips, transistors, all the integrated circuits, the SCADA devices that are used to control industrial processes remotely, they all get destroyed instantly. So all our critical national infrastructure relies on this stuff. So just in an instant, it just knocks out practically everything you can think of. The ground, air, and sea transportation systems, water and sanitation systems, banking systems, telecommunication systems, they all stop working. There will be no food or fuel distribution. You won't be able to pump gas. Pumps won't work. Medical services are unavailable. You can't call anybody. You can't drive anywhere. The rail, port, and air traffic control no longer operate. Planes come falling from the sky. Planes crash. Cars stall. It's chaos. And basically, the multitude of electronic devices that society depends on have suddenly stopped working. So this is within a billionth of a second. It's just instantly. Another thing that happens that it's not. I got this. It was told to me by a man that's the director of a large corporation that does research on this. He's helped write the guidelines, the Department of Defense, so he knows what he's talking about. But he told me that millions of the glass insulators on our power lines, the 15 kilovolt power lines that go to 78% of the homes and businesses, residences, agriculture, all these, they call it flashover. The voltage is so strong that it basically will destroy these insulators, and particularly if it's in cold weather. If you had an EMP attack, say in the winter, it just wrecks them. And if you lose one glass insulator on a line, it can knock the power out on the distribution line for the entire line. So if you lose millions of these, that in itself would be an enormous project to repair, and it would knock the grid out. The E1 also instantly knocks out the power stations, the high voltage substations in the U.S., where the controls and relays there that protect the extra high voltage circuit breakers and the large power transformers are damaged by the E1, and it just knocks the grid out. All the red dots there show the substations that are affected by the detonation over Ohio by one nuclear warhead. Down in the lower corner, you can see that's what a substation looks like. You can see transformer and circuit breakers. So how does it work? What's really important to understand is how the large power transformers operate in the grid. Basically, when you send electricity over a transmission line, you can lose a lot of it unless you step it up to high voltage. So that's the purpose that their transformers transform it at the plant to high voltage. And at the end of the transmission line, it steps it down to lower voltage, and it goes to the end users. And 90% of the electricity in the United States goes through these transformers. They have to have them. Without them, you can't transmit power. This is an image of a large power transformer. They're enormous. There's really only about 3,000 of them this big. These are the very largest ones I'm talking about. 345 kilovolt, 500 kilovolt, and 765 kilovolt transformers. They weigh between 400 and 800,000 pounds each. And they are not stockpiled. We don't even make them. I mean, 80% of them are made overseas. And the current wait time, it's gotten longer. I looked it up a couple days ago. It's 1.5 to 4 years wait to get one of these made because they have to be custom designed and manufactured. And of course, you can't airlift them in there. These are too big to even put on a train. So it's this picture here. When I contacted the company and asked them if I could use it, they said, yeah, this entire rig weighed over 1 million pounds. They're trying to get this thing to a new location. So the extra high voltage circuit breakers are the primary safety and control devices in the grid. And they also take a while to make. There's about a 1-year wait time to get those made, and we don't stockpile those either. And they protect the large power transformers. So the E1 comes down and wrecks the relays, and then it leaves it vulnerable to the EMP3 wave that comes. This image here, it's not great, but it shows the first E1 wave that happens. I don't talk about the E2 wave. It's the equivalent to lightning. It's not considered as dangerous because we have surge protectors, but the E1 is likely to damage your surge protectors. So you have and the E2 is followed by the E3 wave, which induces a massive direct current and voltages and amperages into the power transformers.
And just to understand this graph correctly, like that's the amplitude, so the current, like how high the power is on the y-axis, and the x-axis is time in milliseconds.
Yeah, that's right. It's a little. I didn't want it to make it too technical for everyone, but the main idea is that they work differently. The E1 wave induces the voltages but the E3 induces the direct current. It's a different sort of thing. And the E3 will induce current both above and below ground. In 1962, the Soviets had a series of tests right before the test ban treaty went into effect.
Yes.
They detonated some 300 kiloton weapons, and one of them they detonated. It burned up all the overhead phone lines, all the power lines, and it even sent a surge of electricity through an underground power line 600 miles away to a power plant and set the plant on fire. So the Soviets they were more aware of this than we were. In 1994, I think when it was glasnost, the Soviet scientists actually came and briefed the American scientists on this whole subject.
Wow. Okay.
Another thing that I learned in this process that kind of amazed me was that you can detonate a nuclear weapon over the Yucatan Peninsula, and there's actually two forms of the E3 wave. There's the blast wave and the heave wave. The blast wave effects occur more than 1,000 miles north of where the detonation occurs. So, and it's very powerful. So one detonation over the Yucatan with, say, a megaton weapon could take out the U.S. power grid. It doesn't have the E1 effect. I think if somebody wants to attack the United States or any country, the E1 does so much damage to solid-state electronics that they probably would have the EMP detonation over the country. But, you could have, a missile launched somewhere in the Gulf that detonated over the Yucatan, and it would still take out our grid. And North Korean satellites routinely pass over the continental U.S. and Yucatan Peninsula. They're supposed to be communication satellites, but they've never been observed to communicate anything. So I'm not into demonizing any. There's so much politics involved with all the. But what I'm trying to demonstrate is the danger that nuclear weapons pose.
Yeah.
To everyone.
Yeah, beyond the just the nuclear explosion, and I know that you've also worked with Dr. Ted Postel, and Ted Postel, of
Right.
course, together with others, have shown us like what it would mean if a nuclear weapon exploded over New York. I mean, what the devastation would be. But your point is, look, it goes much further than that. It's the devastation of the infrastructure would be much larger than just the immediate impact side.
Right. It's I think if somebody wanted to defeat the United States, they could do it. But it's not just the United States. Any country that doesn't have their grid protected or their infrastructure or their nuclear power plants is just as at risk as we are. Hard to find. I wrote about the United States because I had access to the information here. I don't know about Russia or China, but it's it's staggering to think what would happen if we suddenly lost all this. Now, I want to say that EMP there's been a concerted effort to denigrate this idea, to downplay it. Partially, that's occurred because there's the utilities, electric utilities don't want to spend the money to protect the grid, and the legislation that's been proposed to date, it's been poorly written, and it would have put the burden on protecting the grid on them. So they created a study not too long ago that just said, oh, EMP isn't a big deal. And I mentioned those officers in the Air Force. They formed what they called the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force at the U.S. Air University. That's the Air Force University. And they wrote a very detailed rebuttal of that report that downplayed EMP. So, but that's confused the issue.
In that case, let's go to the political side in a moment. But you still have a couple of slides for us, right? Let's finish those and then we go.
Sure. Let's see. Well, I was trying to sum up here that there's a congressional commission that studied EMP and had a series of reports, and they concluded that 90% of Americans would die within a year after the loss of all the infrastructure and electricity. We can protect it. The technology exists to protect our grid and our infrastructure, at least to a great extent. And if we could do it for maybe a 1/4 of what has been spent on the Ukrainian war. So it's just a matter of political will. And if we protect the grid from EMP, it will also protect it from these solar storms. They call them coronal mass ejections or geomagnetic disturbance. It's a gigantic solar flare that strikes the Earth directly charged plasma particles, and that has the same effect as the EMP E3 wave. It will take out the grid globally, even if it's big enough. So and that's guaranteed to occur. It happens. The last time, the biggest one that happened last time was in 1859. It's called the Carrington effect, named after Carrington effect. It was named after the astronomer who saw the flare coming. But back then, of course, there weren't many electronic devices, but it set barbed wire fences on fire, knocked telegraph operators out of their chairs. It was a big deal. If we had anything like that now, it would wreck our grid. So we need to do this. This needs to be taken seriously. And the military has protected its weapons and communication systems. In fact, one of those officers in the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force tried to get me access to some of the software programs the Air Force uses to predict EMP damage. And he told me that I was spot on with my predictions about the degree of damage. So if the Air Force believes it, then I think I would accept their findings.
Mm.
So you want me to, I have these other slides that deal with the threat to nuclear power plants.
Yeah. I mean, this is please tell us, like, what would happen to the power plants if such an event occurred? And okay, you just made things worse because you said it's not only humans doing this to other humans, it's also just the solar system doing it to us.
Yeah, that can happen. That's the grid.
All right.
Well, I want to say that the threat to nuclear power plants is not recognized. It's probably the most controversial assertion I've made. I wrote a book on this. It was published in 2023 in that article in the UNS Review, but the Nuclear Regulatory Commission this believes that EMP doesn't pose a threat to the nuclear power plants they regulate. They have a couple of old studies, but they've never done any comprehensive testing on the what's really at risk are the emergency power and the active emergency core cooling systems. These are required to safely shut down a reactor after its emergency shutdown or once it's shut down. And these systems are filled with solid-state controls and components that they've never been tested. And that's what the Air Force officers were complaining about. So since it's not a problem, then none of the plant operators are trained to deal with the effects of an EMP attack. No spare parts are stored at the plants. They're very, very vulnerable, I think. And these are the two reports that were issued by the Air Force that one of them points out the dangers of the spent fuel pools. Spent fuel pool is adjacent to every nuclear reactor, and it stores all the highly radioactive used fuel rods. And the NRC, they listened to the Air Force officers, but they said, well, we don't accept your findings. So when a grid goes down, the E1 waves knocks out the grid, then every operating nuclear reactor in the United States would have to conduct an emergency shutdown. And this doesn't require electricity. It's just bam. They call it a scram, and the plants are shut down. But in the reactor core, there's still an enormous amount of heat because they call it decay heat from the fission products in the spent fuel, in the fuel in the reactor. There's hundreds of millions of watts of heat that are there. So when a reactor is operating normally, they're required within 10 seconds, but it's usually 2 or 3 seconds for the emergency cooling system to kick in. And normally, when a reactor is running, they'll run hundreds of thousands of gallons of water per minute through the reactor core. That's how much heat there is. And the reactor core and the reactor vessel is not that big. It's like 16 feet wide and 30 or 40 feet tall, and half of it's filled with, metal. And so there's a lot of heat in there. If you fail to operate these cooling core systems, the pumps don't work. If there's no power to operate the pumps, and if the pumps are burned up and all the solid state components in them, then the reactor core will quickly overheat. I mean, in a matter of a few minutes, the water in there becomes superheated and turns into steam, and it'll block water flow, and it will self-destruct in a matter of several hours or less. This is what happened at Fukushima. The difference at Fukushima was they had an hour's warning because first there was the earthquake, and that caused a shutdown. So they started a cold shutdown process. And even in the first hour, you can go from 7% to 2% of the heat. You remove 5% of the existing heat it cools off pretty fast. Well, you wouldn't have that with EMP. You'd have all the heat. But once a tsunami hit, it wiped out their emergency diesel generators and the battery bank at Unit 1, and that reactor melted down in a matter of 5 or 7 hours. The other two reactors still had their battery banks. When the batteries ran out, eventually they melted down within a couple of days, and the Japanese government hid that. They didn't tell. They lied about it for months. This is a picture of a control room in a nuclear power plant. So if you lose all the power, it's going to be dark in there. You might have some flashlights. You would not have a plant communication system, and cell phones wouldn't work because of what had happened with the E1. So you wouldn't be able to communicate with anybody outside of that room. You'd have to have runners back and forth. In a nuclear power plant, if the power shuts off and there's no on-site or off-site power, the doors will automatically lock in a lot of places. The valves will freeze open or close. There's all sorts of things that just go haywire. And they have no ability to monitor the temperature or pressure in the core because all those sensors are solid state and they won't work. So they really won't know what's going on. Even the schematics for the plant are stored in computers. So how do you fix that in an hour, right? In my article, these 3 circles were where the nuclear detonations took place. And in those circles, there were 26 commercial nuclear reactors. And, my contention is that all those reactors would melt down within a day or so. But it's not just the United States. France, as far as I know, does not have shielding on their nuclear power plants. And if you detonated a super EMP weapon over France, you could probably cause more than 50 French reactors to melt down at the same time. And that's very alarming to me. That actually has gotten the attention of some of my friends in Europe when I've told them about that. And I'd love to be proven wrong. I'm sure there's some nuclear engineers out there going, "Oh, bull! He has no idea what he's talking about." But my book has 160 references and 340 footnotes. I put all sorts of references and appendices in it because I knew that I would be questioned. So I back up everything I say. This is what happens when a reactor melts down. This is a animation of the cesium-137 spreading across Europe after Chernobyl reactor blew up in 1986. And it had a graphite core. Now, there's 2 Chernobyl-type reactors at the Kursk nuclear power plant that lack containment vessels. They don't have protective concrete domes, and they're very vulnerable to a missile strike. And I've been very concerned about that because, as we've seen in the war, nuclear power plants become targets in war.
Yes.
So this all goes up. Cesium-137 is the second most volatile element after mercury. It's a liquid at room temperature, and it becomes a gas. But when the fuel rods heat to the point of rupture ignition, all the cesium becomes a gas and it goes out. So it becomes the predominant radioisotope and fallout. Now this is a map of the contamination zones, the radio exclusion and radio control zones around the Chernobyl plant. The dark red is where there's greater than 40 curies of cesium-137 per square kilometer. Now, I thought that sounded like a lot, but I realized when I did my research, there's 88 curies in 1 gram of cesium-137. So 1.2 grams of cesium-137 evenly distributed over a square mile makes it uninhabitable. 1/2 gram of cesium-137 makes 1 square kilometer uninhabitable. And there's close to a ton of cesium-137 in the spent fuel rods at every U.S. nuclear power plant. And I did this for the illustrator. Now, American dime weighs 2.7 grams. And if you take that equivalent weight of cesium-137 and make it an aerosol and spread it over Central Park, you can't live there for 100 years or more, and according to current radiation safety standards, at least. So that's how poisonous this stuff is. And these are pictures of the spent fuel pools where the spent fuel has to be transferred underwater every time they do refueling because you can't expose it to air. It would ignite. It also would kill you in a matter of seconds if you're close to it. It has to remain in the pools for at least 6 years. The higher enrichment levels they use now is up to 20 years. And these are enormous concentrations of radioactivity. So, and these pools have to be cooled constantly. Originally, they were designed to hold one or two sets of fuel rods. but they never developed a long-term geologic storage in the U.S. So they use what they call high-density storage, and most every spent fuel pool in the U.S. Is just about completely full. The only time they take rods out is to make room for new rods coming out of the reactors. They refuel the reactor every 18 months or so, and so it's a total accident waiting to happen, in my opinion. And I had a picture of that's a cursed nuclear power plant. You can see the reactors don't have the containment vessels. And this is an image of the spent fuel pool that's right next to the reactor. If a missile lands on that, you're going to have something as bad as Chernobyl or worse. So that's those are my slides. I do have a slide of a 100 megaton bomb going off, but I didn't want to start with that.
Honestly, this is very scary. Because but one thing I still need to understand is whether these super EMP weapons are they a separate class of nuclear weapons from. Sorry, because I don't know much. The only difference I know is tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons. And I always thought strategic nuclear weapons are bigger, mounted on larger missiles, and they're pointed toward, you know, the cities like New York, Seattle, Moscow, St. Petersburg, because you want to strategically threaten the populations of the other one. But what are these EMP nuclear weapons like?
Traditionally, tactical nuclear weapons are smaller. It could be considered battlefield weapons.
Yeah.
Very low yield. Although now they base them more on where they're used and their range as opposed to the yield, because the B-61 tactical nuclear weapons, the gravity bombs that the U.S. has in Europe, are variable yield, so you can have them go up to 50 to 175 kilotons. The strategic nuclear weapon generally is considered the lowest end. It's 90 to 100 kilotons and up. We have a B-83 bomb that has 1.2 megatons. Or 1.3. That's 1,300 kilotons. Now the super EMP weapons are, well, I guess you could say they're theoretical, but the Russian and Chinese military textbooks describe these, and they talk about they have the ability to create 2 to 4 times more E1 energy incident fields than the weapons. What I display in my writing are they're just ordinary nuclear weapons. And that but the thing is, if you detonate a nuclear weapon above the atmosphere, the gamma rays come down and it creates EMP. The higher it is. So, go ahead.
Sorry, but if you don't detonate it above the atmosphere, because the atmosphere is like 40,000 kilometers, like which
yeah, okay, so I'd say 16 to 20 miles, and you can convert that. I'm a typical American, so I guess.
Yeah, okay, 60 to 20 miles, so we're around the range of like 30,000+ kilometers. So if you detonate it below that, let's say you detonated a nuclear weapon around the altitude where airplanes fly, then that wouldn't cause an EMP. But if you detonate it 3 times as high, it might.
No, actually, I mean, a weapon detonated at ground level causes an EMP, but it just doesn't go as far. It would knock things out, some miles away. But, if you see a nuclear weapon go off, you're not going to be worried about the EMP. A Russian 800 kiloton weapon will set 150 square miles on fire instantly. And the Poseidon drone weapon with a 100 megaton weapon will set 7,000 square miles or 18,000 square kilometers on fire instantly. And so that's the scale of these things. But the EMP, EMP is a line of sight phenomenon. So the higher the weapon is above the atmosphere, the more area is exposed to it. But the E1 effect is a little more, it's not quite linear or straightforward. The strongest E1 effects occur between like 60 and 90 miles up. But a warplaner would detonate a weapon at about 100 miles up, I believe, because that way you're kind of maximizing the E1 and the E3 at the same time. Does that make sense? If you just want E3.
Yes, that does make sense. The only nuclear weapons that were ever tested on humans were, of course, in 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And one of the reasons these 2 cities were chosen was not because of the military value, but because they were sitting between the sea on the one hand and mountain ranges on the other. So the test would be reasonably certain that it wouldn't go beyond a certain range. And both of them were, of course, detonated above ground, right? They didn't actually hit the ground. They detonated above the city centers.
Oh, right.
And then the blast, one of the questions these people are trying to answer is like, what are the real world impacts on infrastructure? But they didn't want to expose too large an area to it.
Well, war planners like to, if they want to maximize the blast, they put the detonation at an altitude where there's kind of a double shock wave, because there's a shock wave from the blast. There's also a shock wave that's reflected from the ground, and they combine. If you just want to have thermal effects, you put it probably a little bit higher. But, when I've written about it, the thermal effects, the firestorms are so insane that I don't even talk about blast, because, when you ignite a nuclear weapon, it's like a piece of the sun. A weapon, a conventional weapon, high explosive, burns at like 4,000 to 7,000 degrees, 8,000 degrees Fahrenheit. A nuclear weapon, the moment of detonation, it creates temperatures hotter than the center of the sun, like 100 million degrees Celsius, 180 million degrees Fahrenheit. So that's it. We use TNT, explosive equivalent, to try to explain how powerful it is, but it doesn't even come close to explaining the ferocity of the firestorm and the heat that's. So that's why anything that's beneath the fireball, it literally gets vaporized, turns into gas, and the fires ignited over an area like of 150 square miles in something like 5-10 minutes in an urban area. They will coalesce into one gigantic firestorm. And maybe Dr. Postal has explained this before.
He did. It's just like what you're adding to this discussion is that if you take into consideration the impacts of the EMP blast on the infrastructure, modern society infrastructure, it just these weapons become, in addition to being just barbaric of what they immediately do, I mean, it's almost inevitable that they shut down almost all systems necessary to sustain life on the target area, right? And a very, very large target area. So you basically cannot contain the social fallout from this thing. It's not just the area that gets evaporated, it's everything.
Right. It's a vast area. And, it's not really any more humane, because if you're going to make people freeze and starve to death over the course of a year, I don't know. But at any rate, as I said before, the weapons detonated above the atmosphere, you won't even hear them because there's no atmosphere up there. But this would occur at night, and there would be a gigantic flash of light, like that one image that I showed of the awful wide. And instantaneously, all the power, everything would go off. And then you'll know what happened if you are unfortunate enough to be in that circumstance.
Yeah, but that makes these weapons even more unusable, in the sense that if you use them, it's over. Because, like, also your pictures you showed, you cannot just attack the United States. It's impossible, right? You will immediately affect Canada and Mexico at least.
No, that map that I showed of the three big circles, those are the circles where the EMP takes place. I mean, if you detonate a weapon 1,000 miles up, it won't have the same effect. You have EMP. So there's a point of diminishing returns in terms of the intensity of the EMP. Ideally, it would probably be around 100 to 300 miles. And so you're not going to, you would detonate the weapon over. This is to get the E1 effect. I did show the Yucatan Peninsula detonation that would occur, that would knock the grid out. So that's just E3, and that would take out the U.S. power grid. Or if you made it a little further north, it would take out the Canadian grid. But I put that in there just to show that there's a variety of ways that this could take place.
Right.
We have early warning systems looking for missile attacks, but suppose a freighter off the coast of Panama launches a Scud missile up and detonates a warhead, a 1 megaton, a warhead above the Yucatan. Well, then the grid goes down.
So are there ways actually to protect the grid? Are there ways to?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if you also China and Russia, I mean, if they are aware of this kind of effect, what would they likely do in order to protect their own infrastructure?
Well, that would be interesting to find out. I suspect they've probably done more than we have. Our military is, as I said, has protected their weapons and communication systems, but you can. The grid is definitely protected. Protecting nuclear power plants is harder because there's a lot of lines going in and out, but you can add shielding to all these different cables and things, so you could at least attenuate it. No, I do think that there is some degree of protection because with the concrete containment vessels are lined with steel, and so they're but so that may lessen the impact. But you don't have to have everything go wrong. If you just lose all the emergency power at one of those plants, you're still SOL. I can't say that word on live, but so.
So, okay, the policy implication of your research is that you need emergency planning for this kind of event, and not just
Yeah.
because somebody might fire a weapon, but also because one of these sun flares might actually cause a similar meltdown. It's just sheer luck that we haven't had it yet within the last 80 years of nuclear technology.
Well, that's right. I mean, there's two separate issues. You have to protect the grid from the E3 and the similar solar effects, and you have to protect the infrastructure from the E1, the current that's induced. They're actually, because EMP it's kind of a complex phenomenon, it's just not one single thing, and it's actually difficult to calculate because the good scientists are probably out there shaking their head. Dr. Radasky, if he ever hears it. Because when you calculate EMP, it also there's an angle. The power lines have to be perpendicular to it, and it's not just not everything gets it equally.
Hmm.
But the power lines are big enough and run long enough that they're going to have massive voltages induced into them, and that in itself is enough to just fry just about all the electronics we have. So there's a company that some companies market devices that are supposed to protect for EMP, and I don't know. There may be some available, but I'm not going to advertise for them here. But I do think that it's just imperative that we get some action on this from our legislators. There's no lobbyists up there trying to bribe anybody to do this.
But on the other hand, like when we go to the weapon systems, I mean, we are currently living in a very sad moment when all of the nuclear weapons agreements and in general, like weapons reduction agreements are breaking down, right? The entire structure, even New
Yeah.
Start is probably ending. It's a very sad moment. But if we were not in that moment, and if we master again the ability to actually create nuclear weapons control systems and monitoring systems, would you plea for integrating EMP into those systems and say like, no, we need to check and control and reduce each other's EMP capacities?
Well, the EMP capacity is just a function of using a nuclear weapon to generate EMP.
Right.
There are, they call them, well, there's suitcase size non-nuclear EMP devices that can be used at ground level that can induce EMP in a matter of several blocks. And they could do a lot of damage. If you put one of those within a block of a nuclear power plant, you might be able to mess the plant up pretty badly. But my main concern has been with the nuclear EMP because it is so, one detonation covers hundreds of thousands of square miles or more, and it just has such huge effects on everything. Annie Jacobson writes about that in her book, A Nuclear War: A Scenario.
Mm.
And my UNS review article, I have a kind of a long quote from her in that. So people are aware of it. It's just trying to get somebody to do something about it. It's like a lot of problems, genocide.
Yes, obviously. I'm just, I wonder what the right approach if we had the ability to use the United Nations in order to create a system. the issue is, we live with these nuclear weapons, right? And we're not gonna, even if we decided to destroy them all, we wouldn't lose the knowledge. We cannot uninvent them. We cannot unlearn them. So the only
Right.
thing we can do is to create the structures, like, let's say, for instance, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is a wonderful example of how you then combine control mechanisms with access mechanisms to nuclear to the nuclear components you need, and you create a structure that worked pretty well, not perfectly, but pretty well. So what kind of arrangements on the diplomatic level would we need to create in order to have effective mechanisms to prevent this kind of stuff from potentially occurring? I mean, the man-made one.
Well, if you look at the level of nuclear armament, the United States and Russia have about close to 90% of all the nuclear weapons in the world. So that's where nuclear disarmament has to start. But you can, and we can't uninvent nuclear weapons, but how much better off would we be if we only had 500 nuclear weapons that are deployed, and instead of 5,000 or 6,000, or if we had 100? I mean, the smaller the deployed arsenals become, the less apocalyptic the results will be if they are unleashed. And I don't think I don't buy the idea that, well, we know how to make them, so there's nothing we can do about it. There's a lot we can do about it. And once if you actually go down a path of disarmament, that also is a path of building trust. And once there's no longer weapons at launch-ready status, U.S. ICBMs are kept with their motors powered up 24 hours a day, with guys sitting at consoles 24/7 waiting for the launch codes so they can, And Russia's got the same thing. Their National Command Authority can actually override all the lower levels of command and launch directly from their headquarters. So we're always on thin ice. We just don't see it. The U.S. always has four submarines at hard alert status, where they're in position to fire, and other subs rotating back and forth. There's this big nuclear dance going on all the time, but we don't see it. My students used to come into my class, and they just have no clue. I almost felt bad teaching them about it because it's such a grim topic. And after about 3 weeks, they're all like, "Oh my God," But I think it's important for people to understand this threat, because, well, if we don't have an informed public, how can we affect any change?
Yeah,
That's
because
why I like shows like yours.
no, we need to muster again the political will on the ground to demand that this lunacy needs to be contained. I mean, even if
Right.
we cannot get it completely away, but we need to work on that. And sometimes people surprise me because they start making arguments. Oh, but mutually assured destruction. It's a system of security and stability. Therefore, we don't have it. And I'm like, look, why is it that Germany today, and a weapon state that has no, well, okay, Germany is maybe a bad example because they have like a US nuclear weapon station, nuclear sharing, which is basically this joke, but bad joke.
Right.
But anyhow, let's take another one. Why is it that Spain, I think Spain has none, but I'm not sure. Why is Spain not afraid of the nuclear weapons of France? Because they have a good relationship, goddammit. It's
Right.
simple.
Right.
If you have friendly relations, you don't worry about the nuclear weapons of the other. So the best protection for the US and Russia from each other's nuclear weapons would be to have a good relationship. So I cannot,
Exactly.
for the love of me, understand why there are people in the US who the warmongers who believe that the more of these things you have and the more you threaten the Russians, the safer you get. It's just a lunatic idea.
Well, it is, and it's a lack of historical understanding. The Soviets lost 27 million people killed
Yeah.
fighting the Nazis in World War II, and uh, they have a they do not tolerate. They're not going to allow anything like that to happen again, and so they see the war in Ukraine as an existential threat to them. Um, and here, I don't know. The whole issue of mutual assured destruction seems to have gone out the window. I don't even know about nuclear deterrence anymore, because when you see attacks on Russian strategic early warning systems and bombers being conducted clearly with the aid of U.S. Satellite, or at least British, you have to have national technical means to guide all these drones to the targets. That was unthinkable during the Cold War.
Yeah.
We never. But now it's this idea. Well, he'll back down. They're not gonna launch a nuclear weapon at us. But I'm afraid the Russians have sort of reached a boiling point with, if they have constant attacks on their oil refineries and their airports and their cities with drones, the people there are going to demand some sort of action. And the Russians, I think they'll probably use Oreshniks. But I'm amazed here. We live in this delusional world in the United States where the leaders, I think they think it's 1991 still, and we have the biggest armies and the best weapons. And it's a joke. Our Patriot missile systems can't shoot down Russian missiles. It's all 20th century technology. The Russians have 4 or 5 different versions of hypersonic missiles. We don't even have one. We can't shoot them down. Why would you want to have a war with somebody that can fire a Sarmat missile that can go over the South Pole, evade all your early warning systems, and hit you with hypersonic glide vehicles that come in at Mach 18 or Mach 20 with carrying, maybe megaton warheads? That's insane. I don't understand any of this.
I am having this working hypothesis at the moment that one of the major problems is that some of the people who take these decisions, especially in the West, especially in the United States, the major problem is that they think primarily in terms of marketing, of what does it look like to our people in the propaganda sphere. So
Right.
and the whole idea at the moment of these strategists is that you can pull off a proxy war with Russia where your systems kill Russians, but they can't do the same to you because they don't have the proxy, right? Therefore, we're safe, right? Because it would, the Russians, it would look bad if they attacked the mainland. It would look bad and it would escalate. But it rests upon the idea that the Russians care about what it looks like to public perception.
Good point. Well, I think we believe our own propaganda.
Yeah.
And the idea that Trump can pose as a mediator when he's really a co-belligerent, it's a joke. The whole thing. I don't know if the Russians are just trying to humor him because they think he's crazy or what. But I do think we're reaching a point where the Russians, they've decided that they're going to win on the battlefield. And NATO doesn't have a way, unless they want to try to use nuclear weapons, there's no way they're going to stop the Russians.
Luckily, we don't have that. I mean, that's the one thing over 3.5 years we learned is that the nuclear realm has been, although it was touched, it's true, it was touched with the attacks on the nuclear, strategic nuclear bombing fleet of the Russians. It was touched, but it was left mostly intact. And the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, yes, they were touched, but had the decision been taken, you could have seriously destroyed this thing, right? I mean, NATO has the capability to do that. They didn't. So
No, I agree. I think that they haven't crossed every line. But there's some things I don't think the Russians will tolerate if the Germans start firing Taurus missiles into Russia.
Yeah.
Or, the British with their Storm Shadows. I think I heard someone say that the Russians may hate the British as much as the Germans at this point. So it's really bad. Like you said, there's no trust. We've gone in the opposite direction. The Minsk Accords were demonstrated to be a ruse. So why would Russia want to sign another treaty if the U.S. is, well, Hollande and Merkel admitted that the Minsk was just a way to give time for Ukraine to rearm. Why would you want another ceasefire? Why would the Russians want it?
My at this point, my hope is actually with the Russians because they're the ones who have shown the most willingness to still go that route, including, of course, saying like we are going to voluntarily extend the the ban on nuclear testing. Start voluntarily. We're gonna abide by it, although we don't have to anymore, in the hope that the Americans gonna do the same. So there is still hope that you can create something, a policy structure, but it doesn't look rosy from the West, I would say, which is why I get so angry with our side.
Yeah, I do too. Well, I don't want this to be all doom and gloom, but I mean, I think I wanted to at least put out the information about EMP because it's so misunderstood. It's here it's been considered sort of a neocon issue. I think I was kind of laugh because I'm the opposite of a neocon. And I do want to say also, for people that might wonder, I'm not a big fan of nuclear power, primarily because of the radioactive waste. But I don't want to see nuclear power plants melt down.
Yes.
I want to see them at least protected from EMP. So, if you get my book, you can. I'm more explicit about that.
I'll put the link to it into the description below. Where should people go who want to either buy that book or find your articles? Where are they published?
Okay. Well, I have a website called nuclearfamine.org. I spent a lot of time. I worked as an expert witness at the United Nations, testified for Switzerland and New Zealand about nuclear winter and launch on warning. So I've got a lot of information about that. I have my EMP. The article that I wrote for the UNS Review in June of this year on the EMP attack, I have that on my website, and you can also go to the UNS Review to find that. And Amazon and Barnes and Noble sell my book. You can type in Stephen Starr, Stephen with a V, Starr with 2 R's, and I think comma EMP attack or something like that, and you should be able to find it.
Okay, I'll see if I can put the link directly into the description, so people can find you. Professor Stephen Starr, thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.